Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to a virtual summit with DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. Got to give a plug to Future Proof. Our TV show season 12 is coming soon. We got our own time slot in Washington, D.C. now on Channel 10. So check your local listings for the world's first made-for-TV webinar series, all about how today's technology is designing tomorrow. So what are we talking about today? Let's just dive right into it. Data observability on blast. That's right. We have a presentation for you, a couple of them, and then a radio show. So let's dive right in here. We'll be hearing from, of course, yours truly. Eve Mulkers is going to be dialing in. Bhaskar Sunkara from Bicycle is here, and our good buddy Chris Krishnan as well. And let me just go ahead and dive right in. So what is data observability? Well, basically, I call it IoT for data. So if you think about what IoT does is you put sensors on devices that are all around in the real world, and those sensors send information back to the mothership so you know what's going on. This could be on an oil rig, for example. It could be your cell phone. It could be any number of device that's an endpoint out there in the edge, and it sends information back, which can be very useful. If you've got an oil rig, you could have sensors all over that rig on the power. You could have sensors on the different pipes that go through any of the devices that come together to make that all happen. You have sensors there to alert the mothership that there's a problem. Well, that's what we're now seeing in the world of data as well. It's for metrics, traces, logs, and status. And I'm throwing in context just for some kicks here. We'll see what our friends say about all that. So data observability refers to the practice of monitoring, measuring, and ensuring the quality, reliability, and performance of data pipelines and data sets. It's all good stuff. Here's a blast furnace, thanks to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's really kind of like a big data pipeline, isn't it? If you look at how you have raw materials that go in, you have this air preheater, you have this furnace that crystallizes basically, that creates the chemical reaction such that you can get good old-fashioned lead bullion to come out. And that's how you make this stuff. So it's very similar. That's why I thought I'd throw that graphic up there. But why now? Why is data observability blowing up these days? And it's just amazing because I went to KubeCon last November and I looked around and there were like 50 data observability vendors. Well, one big reason why is because of this thing called Kubernetes. Of course, Google came along and figured out that there was going to be a real serious issue in the world of enterprise computing if there wasn't a solution. And they came up with that called Kubernetes. It's basically distributed compute is what it boils down to. So you have these containers. It's a container orchestration program, technically. And inside the containers are instructions, like little system processes, basically. And then the orchestrator will spin out these containers. They go and do their thing, and then they disappear. And because of that, we've solved all kinds of problems around what is the operating system in this environment? What's the operating system in that environment? It's really facilitating a very federated view of the world, which, guess what, is the reality now, is going to be the reality for some time, called hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud, I don't think is ever going to go away. We thought about, oh yeah, maybe cloud. It is certainly the center of gravity these days, but there's also the edge. There's also on-prem. Neither of those things are going to go away. So we're going to have these distributed environments. It's going to be very complex, and that's why you need all this observability. So 451 came up with a couple of years ago the top 4 categories: application performance monitoring, right? Think App Dynamics. And Bhaskar used to be the CTO at App Dynamics. So it's pretty cool that we have him on the show today. Infrastructure monitoring: is the equipment working? Log management and real user monitoring. That's an interesting one. RUM for short, for those of you who like Bacardi. Real user monitoring, that's also very important to understand. What is someone doing on our website? They're all over the place, clicking on this, clicking on that. All this information can be used to understand how to better design the site. That's what excites me the most, but also troubleshoot when things go wrong. Why are things going wrong? We'll talk about that on our show today as well. So what's the same? You know, when things are the same, and pretty much all these tools are designed for the purpose of understanding a baseline, what is normal, and then understanding what is not normal. Well, you can't know what's not normal until you know what's normal. So that's your baseline. So first you understand, okay, this is the normal situation that we want to see. And then anytime you get a significant variance from that, that's when you have to take some action to do something about it. That's not normal. So what's the same? This is all pretty much the same. It looks good. And whoa, what are these guys? That's different. If there's something different, and here's the thing with outliers, they can either be erroneous, meaning it could be bad data, it just could be a mistake of some kind, or they are very important things to be watching for, right? So there are two things, but any outlier is either something that's wrong or something that is very, very significant and needs to be paid attention to. So that's just a general rule about how these things work. So traditional data monitoring versus data observability, really it's reactive versus proactive is what it really gets down to. So in the traditional data monitoring world, yes, we look for errors. When errors happen, we try to find them. You don't have a whole lot of visibility. You don't have a whole lot of context. With data observability, the whole idea is to turn that around and to get really ahead of that game, to be monitoring the feeds that go into the data pipelines, for example, so you understand what's happening. Did a field change? Is there a new column in this data set? Did the values change somehow? Do you start having text strings like letters in the phone number field? Well, these are all indications that something went wrong. There's a truncation maybe, or just something didn't load properly. But what you want to do is get a very early warning sign that something is going to happen, so you don't wait until something goes through the entire process and comes out the other side messed up. That's not the situation that you want. So because we can't get this visibility, we are getting these visibilities today, and that's what's really changing in our industry here. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to stay on top of really important stuff. This is actually the lab at the Tisch MS Center in New York, where we'll be going later this year for my better half. But these are very, very important things that need to keep track of, right? So that's why you have observabilities. You're trying to keep track of very important things in your environment. So lots of other different use cases, data lineage, tracing the origins and transformations of data, like compliance auditing. Data quality metrics are important. Is the metrics, is the quality going down? Should we take some effort to resolve this? Data profiling, analyzing data distributions and anomalies, so identifying data skew in machine learning models, and data drift detection, monitoring changes in data distributions over time. It is a fast-moving world, folks. That's another reason why we have all this technology now, because things are changing so fast. It's very difficult to stay on top of this stuff. So you have to get ahead of the game. You must get out front. And if you do, that's what you're going to look like. Isn't that what you want? That's what everybody wants. So you can do it yourself, or you can bring in the big guns. Bhaskar is here to take us through the next phase. So I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Everyone can see the screen. I definitely don't have a cool radio voice like Eric. I also do have a little bit of a cough and a cold, which is sort of going around. So maybe that's a good excuse not to have that. Actually, what I'm going to do quickly, what I'm going to do in my talk is focus on context. So the last thing that Eric threw into his slides, focus really on that. But talk about observability, around it. Quick background, I run a startup called Bicycle, and that's sort of in the data space. It's AI-powered insights, AI-powered sort of analytics. But my background, I spent about 10 years, one of the founders and the CTO at AppDynamics, so pretty deep experience in observability. And one of the things we're trying to do at Bicycle is to bring the discipline of automation and monitoring, especially looking at what's normal, how do you sort of make decisions on what's normal and what's not normal right now at Bicycle. So what I'm going to do is that just use this as the anchor, which is defining data, defining information, defining insight, and really talk about observability and what's kind of important and how is context important around this, right? So let's define data first. So what is data? So if you take, and again, like I'm talking more with respect to businesses that are defined by software, where software is essentially driving the core workflows that run the business. There are really two types of data, right? Like there's a ton of monitoring and analytics solutions. On the right, if you look at live streaming data, these are coming from all the customer touch points that touches the core software that runs the business. These are the speeds and feeds, infrastructure metric, cloud metrics, etc. But when you look at the left, there's all this business data, which is more static, more metadata. So customer revenue, partners, suppliers, could be contract information, could be all of that. Now, usually when you take something in isolation, so like let's take heap usage, let's take disk utilization, let's take throughput, that is sort of really what data is. It is an isolation, and you can't make a lot of decisions based on just data, right? Even if you come look at the left, you can really look at what is the lifetime value of a customer, how much revenue they're bringing in, but it's hard to sort of like combine and look at how the customer is experiencing it, right? So again, data is in isolation, can't make a lot of decisions based on that. Now, if you look at all of the tooling, all of the platforms, just pick some of them here for both live streaming data and for business data. There's a lot of like APM solutions, infrastructure solutions, log analytics like Splunk, observability solutions. And then obviously there is a lot of infrastructure, warehouses, BI, where on the left you start converting BI into facts, and that's traditionally been more focused on reporting. Looker, Tableau, etc., sort of generate, all of these reports. So again, going back to the initial slide, let's move to information. Like, what is information? In any software-driven business, again, if you want to start processing a domain entity, right? Like you can process a server, you can process a transaction, you can process a customer. All of these in isolation, you can get a bunch of information about something, right? So, for example, on the right, one of the typical examples is usage and performance as expected. So my last startup, Web Dynamics, that's kind of the question we used to answer. We used to focus on transactions, and so login, search, booking, add to cart, etc., and whether usage and performance were super important. And that was something that was very, very critical, because if something's off with your search or your booking, your core transactions, you're basically losing business, right? So super important question, and that's the information distilled out as an example. Now, if you look at the left, you're like, okay, let's create a report that shows who our top 3 lifetime value renewal customers are, and that's a very, very important report as well, because you get to make decisions on who to focus on, who to prioritize, etc. But both of these examples that I gave you are basically for domain-specific decision making, right? But in today's world, software is your business and business is your software. So you have to basically go the extra mile now to start figuring out how to really harness and combine these insights and make them more operational. And again, like this is what I was defining in the last slide on information as data that has been processed and aggregated and organized with respect to your domain. But again, how do you strive for insights and make it more insight driven? So let's define what is an insight, right? Coming back to the thesis of how these 3 are not important, are not the same, and having defined data information, let's define insight. So what is an insight? It's basically context across data sets, right? Like I would say there's really 3 things that that really make up an insight. So there's the context, which is the context about what is really happening. So for example, you could say that you could either say the impact was for a user, or you could say the impact was for a customer. And both are different statements, right? When you say the impact is for customer, then you're attaching context to it. How important is the customer? What is their lifetime value? And how important are they to the business? Are they a new customer? Are they due for renewal? There's all this context basically associated with it. So that's number one. That's, actually having kind of context. The second piece is continuous, right? Having a way of really operationalizing this and making it continuous across basically a stream of time. And then also not making it so that you have to keep going back to a dashboard and keep looking at, I want to actually look at a particular insight for a particular customer, for a cohort of customers, or for a segment of customers. You need to figure out what is the action that you would take and make it sort of like more continuous. The action is coming after, but making it continuous is the second part of the insight. And how do you sort of like really start to create some automation around it? The third thing is clarity. Whether it is the business team, whether it's the software team, whoever is processing it, having clarity on this is basically what's happening, and depending on the business strategy, taking some action, around it. So let's take an example of how context, being continuous and having clarity come together to drive some action with an example. So this is a good example of combining everything together. So if you notice from some of my previous examples, I combined it together, and the question we're asking, which needs processing of data across both these silos, is tell me when platinum customers are experiencing usage issues with our latest release, right? And that's sort of continuous, right? Because you'll keep doing releases and you want a system that's always on. You don't want a system where when you pull up the dashboard, it's on and otherwise, it is not, right? So that's kind of the core of it. And so how do you do it, right? I mean, you have to basically make sure you're combining both of these. You have to also make sure that you're not only looking at the combination of streaming data and the business data, but you also have a way of looking at what's normal, what usage is normal for a particular platinum customers. Because again, usage can be based on different customers, will be different for different customers. So you have to apply the context for a particular customer or a cohort of customers with respect to live data. And so that's where the combination kind of really comes in. And then the other thing you want to do is going back to the definition of insight, it has to be continuous and it has to drive action, right? So when you want to take an action on when platinum customers are experiencing usage issues, now these are your most important customers, right? And presumably this is something that you would do to address an issue that your platinum customers are facing, where you're kind of templatizing an action of sending an email saying, hey, we notice you're having this issue before they call you, right? I mean, you hear this so commonly across so many situations where when we talk to customers, they're like, look, we don't know what's going on in time, especially the business folks, right? They know when a customer calls in. And that sort of, in today's day and age, with the type of infrastructure we have, with the type of data processing power we have, that is just inexcusable, right? So you got to put all these things together and make it actionable, make it continuous, and make it automated. So this is a good example of an insight like that driving an action and then sort of like really automating that. So now let's look at, as we kind of really look at how this is done right now. And I'll obviously generalizing, we don't have enough time to go into some of the details of it. But if you think about it right now, this is the solution landscape, right? There is the foundation. So let's break it into three parts. There's the foundation, which is you want to get all the performance data, you want to get the systems of record, all the metadata, you want to basically arrange all of that. There's all the tooling that's around it. There's an overload of data that you're processing. Then you take it to a layer where you do all this correlation. So basically you're cobbling together multiple delivery events with a delivery ID and saying, hey, what was the end-to-end delivery time? You are cobbling together a lot of supplier events to figure out how the supplier performance was, what devices was it working on, and what was the latency, where was this happening, all of these different pieces, right? So you're looking at business elements, you're looking at software elements, combining that streaming data, and that's kind of the middle layer. And eventually what you want is you're really driving an insight, you're really routing an insight to either people or systems or code, right? Because that's how you create an operations kind of framework on insights driving something versus insights statically being consumed from dashboards. So whether you're notifying the right roles, whether you're doing something like reverse ETL, and an example of that could be you have an insight that needs to be pushed to Salesforce, right? Like some action needs to be taken by a rep or a marketing contact based on an insight, and that needs to be pushed to Salesforce. That's how you get that automation. So that's the second piece, which is how do you deliver it to the right systems at the right time? And the third one could be an automated response, right? And that's usually code, take a webhook or something like that. Some of our customers are already doing that where, they have circuit breaker type of situations on, hey, something's sort of broken in the chain right now, and let's do a circuit breaker to kind of figure out what's really happening. And eventually, this is what leads it into an AI insights powered business operation. So this is sort of how everything sort of lines up in terms of how you need to kind of deliver a solution. But there's no real holistic approach right now. What's happening right now is that there is obviously a ton of infrastructure, whether it is the warehouses, whether it is the lake houses, a ton of innovation, really amazing products in building the foundational data. The second area, which is correlating business and live software streaming data, that is a lot of work. There are giant data teams that are figuring this out with a lot of enterprises. there are exclusive resources that are dedicated to figuring out how to tie all this stuff together, build some sort of discipline around it, and eventually, deliver this. But if you look at the time or the effort or the cost, it's definitely, super going up. And there's no easy way of having a solution that basically delivers the top layer of actionable insights and sort of like having an insights driven culture around it. So that's kind of high level of what I wanted to cover, some of the issues and some of the problems that we're solving. So real quick, as we wrap up, what can you do today just based on this thesis, right? Number one, be more insight driven. Figure out how to sort of start more with what's kind of the core use case, what's the insight that should drive action based on your business, based on your priorities. Have a way of saying there's continuous delivery of insights. Number two, continue to kind of get both the worlds together where instrument your code software with business metadata. And number three, obviously, that's kind of where I think I just plug a little bit of Bicycle. Be on the lookout for new AI-based insights platforms that are focused on business operations and can let you drive on business operations. And the last piece is this is a quick preview of Bicycle. Bicycle verticalizes a lot of the solutions. We focus on travel, fintech, and e-commerce. And what we start with is, based on a vertical, we first give you an opinion on what are the core use cases that you need to do. So these are your insights organized in different folders, and what are the insights we do. This typically takes a lot of work, and we're cutting down a lot of the cost of ownership and the time to market for you to sort of generate these insights from raw data, whether it's from a warehouse, whether it's from streaming systems like Kafka. And the next step is automatically generate the insights. So use machine learning to actually generate the insights based on the context. Number three, subscribing to these insights. Again, as I mentioned, how do you route it to people? How do you route it to code? How do you route it to systems? And then the final step is you receive the insights, process the insights, whether they're in Slack, whether they're in code, etc. So that was it mainly from my side. And
yeah, no, this is fascinating.
That's
It's fascinating stuff. And I presume you'd agree that the so-called modern data stack has made things even more interesting now, right? Because we have multiple layers and you have to go through those layers to get to the bottom of stuff and come back. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the innovation on data processing, whether it's the ETL pieces and how do you use compute really well, how do you minimize data movement, all of that type of stuff. I think there's amazing innovation. I think the innovation that's not been enough is the consumption layer on how do you really operationalize them, how do you almost industrialize insights. That's the part I think that needs more work. But you're right about that part.
Yeah, that's very interesting. How do you industrialize insights? I like the way you say that the insight has to be continuous and it has to drive action. Because
Correct.
if it doesn't drive action, then what did it do? It didn't.
What did it do? Exactly.
It's left in a vacuum somewhere, right? And obviously, every time you take an action, I mean, the nice thing about these machine learning models is that they can learn over time.
Correct.
So when you take an action, say, aha, yes, this is a problem. Now you've defined a pattern that should be monitored for, right?
Correct. Yeah, I think that there's really two pieces to the AI. One is context, which is now the large language models allow you to put in the vertical context to figure out what to do. And then there's the auto ML based data interpretation, because you can use that context and then look at revenue by product, revenue by supplier, revenue by carrier, things like that, which are common in verticals.
Well, and so you bring up a really good point here. We have just a couple of minutes left in our keynote component of the show here, but you have so many variables to choose from, and the magic is when you find the 4 or 5 that have some covariance that belong together so you can understand something, but the permutations are borderline endless. So my question to you is, how do you short circuit the process, or how do you expedite that process to only examine what is most likely a causal relationship, or can you do that?
Yeah, I think I would say the focus is on, based on your business priorities, start with being insight driven, right? And what I mean by insight driven is, if you want to focus on renewal customers, if you want to focus on customers who are bringing in the most revenue, etc. Start with figuring out how do you create an insight like that, and start from figuring out how do you operationalize an insight like that. So that way, you're really having a life cycle for the insight from beginning to the end, and you get committed to like, what insight should I consume and operationalize and automate, versus having a bottom-up way of like, I want everything all the time, which is great, but it doesn't lead you to something actionable. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. That's interesting. And I also like this priority of top clients, platinum clients. I have a buddy of mine who is a communications guy, but he's a bartender for a while. And he taught me that number one rule in bartending is to take care of your tip jar.
Yeah, for sure.
So you pay attention to the people who tip you, and you get them their fastest.
Gotta follow the money.
I mean, follow the money and pay attention, because you can get lost. I mean, this is, I think, the blessing and curse of this space is you can get lost in the complexity very easily and spin your wheels for days. And that's the whole thing you're trying to stop with these technologies. You're trying to facilitate troubleshooting, problem solving, and then really design. That's my last question to you. I mean, I talked about reactive versus proactive. And yes, we're getting a lot further ahead of the 8 ball these days, if you will. So we're not getting behind the 8 ball so much. But do you see this sort of opening the door to redesigning information systems in more efficient ways? And if so, how would that work?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think redesigning information systems with respect to consumption, right? I think you have to go away from like dashboarding to basically operations frameworks, and that's when it'll actually change, because you will, your machine learning will actually deliver an insight that will be routed to the right time, right place. And again, a lot of times you will have to have collaboration to figure out what needs to be done. A lot of times the action that needs to be done will be very clear, right? So there's a lot more work to be done, because once you have an insight, sometimes it's very clear what needs to be done. Sometimes you need to drill down more and make a decision. And that's why I think you need to combine some of the context with some of the live streaming, processing, automating, and monitoring. That's been all the good work in the observability space.
Fantastic stuff. Well, this concludes our keynote. DM Radio is coming up next. Stand by.